All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. I'm seeing people trickle in now. If you could fill out the 2-question poll that you see on your screen of how excited for you are this webinar, and if you had to pick just one, even though we know there are many, what's your biggest business challenge right now? That would be great. And we'll get started in just a few minutes. As a reminder, this is a webinar about hiring and retaining your next diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging practitioners by AllVoices and Findem. So we'll give a couple seconds here as people are trickling in and giving responses now. If throughout the conversation you also have questions or comments or want to engage with us as well, feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function too. All right, I will get started. A lot of folks, 50% of people ready. I love attending these webinars. That's the spirit we love to see here. So I'm going to end the poll and then jump into an introduction of myself. So hi everyone, my name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm a senior partnerships manager here at AllVoices and host of Reimagining Company Culture, our interview series and podcast. This webinar is hosted by AllVoices and Findem. As I mentioned, for folks who aren't familiar, AllVoices is an employee intelligence platform to systemically ask for, accept, analyze, act on all kinds of feedback. We know you'll find really great ideas and also bad habits in real time. We really want to reduce that turnover and recruiting costs. Findem turbocharges talent acquisition with AI from search to hire. Talent leaders from Fortune 100 companies to startups are really leveraging Findem to massively increase their talent pipeline, raise candidate quality, diversity, and shrink their time to hire by 80%, which is incredible. If you'd like to start making those amazing hires, you can visit Findem's website, which I'll put in the chat as well, and connect with their team. We know that hiring the right diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practitioners is a fundamental piece to success of the organization and DEI initiatives within your company. So as such, it's really critical to be thoughtful about the hiring process for these roles and really set folks up for success once they come into the company. To set the stage for the conversation, in one survey, 81% of folks reported that they believe diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are really beneficial to their organizations, but 31% of respondents reported they're not having enough resources to really support and really reach those DEI goals and initiatives that the company has set forth. We've also seen, I'm sure folks have been on LinkedIn looking at different roles, and diversity, equity, and inclusion roles have been up 71% in the past 51 years. And another study shows 52% of talent teams surveyed in Findem's recruiting trends survey in 2022 said they plan to hire a diversity leader, and finding more diverse candidates was the #1 priority overall of talent leaders surveyed, and the candidate experience in the interview process were cited as the biggest barriers to recruiting diverse talent, and 59% of talent leaders cited DEI as the top trend that they are likely to shape the industry over the next few years. So with that context, I will stop chatting and I will pass it to our 2 awesome panelists. If you could introduce yourselves, include a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, role, the work you do at your company, and also something that has recently brought you joy. Antonio, do you want to go first?
Sure thing, if I can find my mute button. Hi, everyone. My name is Antonio Mannings. He, him. I am the head of DEI and internal portfolio at Amount, which is a fintech here in Chicago. Let's see, something that brought me joy recently. Took my motorcycle out for a nice long ride over the weekend. That was great. Hadn't had an opportunity to do that in some time, but in that I had an opportunity as well to link up with other vets from the local VFW post and really talk about our experiences and how we're looking to impact folks in the work that they do.
That's great. A lot of people were enjoying the weather this weekend, that's for sure. My name is Lauren Skuchas. I work as a talent partner at Findem, which was already introduced earlier on the call. And my role here at the company is really acting as a liaison between our customers and our services team. A little bit about myself: I have 20 years of recruiting experience, and I think what's brought me joy recently is I've moved full-time to Napa Valley. So I'm really enjoying a change of pace and lifestyle.
I love that. Both great answers and something that is not work related, which is also really great too. Everybody living their fullest lives. For today's panel, I would love to start out from the beginning, at least with a rhetorical question. In my mind, this always comes up in terms of what is the right time? Are we too small? Is it ever too late? Is it ever too early? When is the right time to hire a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging practitioner or operator in your organization? From a recruitment perspective, Lauren, I would love your feedback first.
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, when you're willing to spend money for that problem, whatever challenge you're addressing, I think there's a lot of intention, but the how in which that you're going to address your intention of change is really important. And so until you're ready to spend money, whether that's for the right person, for the right initiatives, the right resources, it's not the right time. I'll turn it over to you, Antonio.
Okay, I didn't want to jump in. I know sometimes I like to take a breath before I get on to my next thought. I say the time is now. I think always is the right time. But before I get into the right time, I want to kind of qualify something. The question is about when's the right time to hire your DEIB practitioner. So for some folks, they'll wonder, well, who's the DNI or DEIB practitioner? Who should that be? Is it the chief people officer or talent or human resources, or is it a chief diversity officer? Well, I'm going to tell you all something. It's everyone. Everyone in your organization should be practicing DEIB in some level, in some form. So while we know that every job is a customer service job, and we know that every company is a tech company today, we should also know that every role should be focused on developing the diversity, equity, and inclusion for all employees within the organization. So now that we've qualified who is who, let's talk about what the what is. So currently, about 32% of Gen Z and 28% of millennials are open to career opportunities. But employers will have to meet their conditions first. So what are some of these conditions? In order to get the right folks in the right role at the right time in their career, we need to figure out what these conditions are. Well, for some of them, it's immediate feedback. They want to know how they're doing today. They don't want to wait for a 6-month review period. They don't want to wait till the end of the year. Well, how do they know when you're reviewing if you're not putting it in your hiring ad? Well, maybe that's something that can help, right? So immediate feedback, immediate perks, rewards and bonuses, those sorts of things. But we also need to think about how we're talking about these things. And I'm going to say talking in air quotes because it's in text there. How we're describing what we're offering to our group of future employees, or as we call them at Mounties.
Absolutely. I think those are really good points as well. You need to have budget and resources when you're willing to invest in a full-time role in this capacity as well, whether it's a diversity, equity, and inclusion program manager, chief diversity officer, chief people officer. And at the end of the day, everybody should be thinking about how they can really build equitable processes, whether they're a hiring manager, whether they're a software engineer, no matter where you are in the organization as well. Antonio, go ahead.
Sorry, one thing to add that Antonio, kind of touched on is the practitioner piece. Like maybe it's not a full-time hire today, and maybe you are using your head of talent or your head of HR and training and developing, providing training and developing opportunities for them to be that practitioner in your organization. Or maybe it's a part-time consultant or somebody who can come in as an unbiased outsider and to give you some type of guidance. So it doesn't necessarily have to equal a full-time hire, but having a practitioner, having somebody who is, maybe responsible to some degree to think about this is really important.
I like that you mentioned responsibility, and I'm sure I'll talk more about responsibility and accountability a little bit later, but there needs to be one person or one group of folks who are dedicated to this work within the organization, and then everyone else spreading out from there. So there needs to be someone or some group within the organization leading this charge. A lot of the times we find in organizations, these are folks who have been delegated this responsibility by proxy. You've been here the longest, now you're in charge. Or you've managed this group, now you're going to manage this other group. So they come into the role sometimes blind, not knowing what to expect. But I'll tell you, there's so many resources that are available for folks in this position. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit as well.
Absolutely. I like the words that you both used in terms of responsibility, dedication, and what it comes down to in terms of accountability and really outlining what that looks like. On one end, when folks are interviewing for very specific roles in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and being that person to kind of lead the charge and as well and provide guidance to, whether it's mostly internal, when you're interviewing at an organization who is hiring for this type of role, what kinds of questions, how do you really identify their dedication and commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do you look at that authentic commitment? What questions do you ask or ask yourself as well? Antonio, I'll pass to you first.
Sure. So when I think about the folks who are actually applying for the role, and they're in the hot seat and you want to ask them the questions, you need to figure out where they're coming from. So the questions about experience and background are great, but also what have you done with that experience and background? Have you served on any employee resources groups? Have you stood up new groups? If we're looking at the employer side or the business side, what's your corporate responsibility experience? How have you been able to impact those things and then report out on them? So some of the questions that I like to ask, where have you worked? What sort of roles have you worked on in the diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging? What sort of experiences do you have with the ERGs? What are the outputs of those ERGs? For many folks, and I keep saying many because it's wide open right now. Everyone's running towards DEI work full force, and that's great. But many times they miss the mark because they haven't identified where they hope to go. So how have you set goals in the past? How have you measured against these goals? How have you reported against those measurements? To whom are you reporting? These are the sorts of questions that help us identify who might be the best person for the role. Soft best person. What we're thinking really is the right person at the right time in their career.
I think even taking it a step backward, like if you're looking at, kind of that initial interview stage, asking the why, like, why is this something that you care about? Why is this something you're interested in? Why is this something that you value as a person? And getting to know that person's motivation. Through that question, you can really understand like their alignment to your philosophy. Are we looking at diversity or inclusion or belonging through the same lens? If the answer is yes, then all of these other questions are great to follow because you're then understanding what that kind of that practitioner role, in which ways have you practiced these philosophies or these motivators or these best practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lauren, 10 years ago, anybody who's spent any time with me will hear me say this again and again. 10 years ago, I was the president of a diversity committee. It was an ERG within the organization. And then some 5 years ago, it was a diversity and equity role. And now it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some folks are adding B for belonging or A for accessibility, T for tolerance, J for justice, and all these other things. I think how we think about the entire bucket of work is how we should be thinking about it. We can't say, oh, just diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because it doesn't count for all these other things. So how do we get to the point? And this isn't a rhetorical question. Christina, you can pop in as well. So also Lauren, how do we get to the point where these potential practitioners are also able to identify everything else that's in that bucket, or much more than just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 letters?
It's a tough question to answer.
Yeah. In my experience, I think it's really again, background and experience, but forward-looking as well. When we set those goals, what's our target state? And if we look at our target state and say, okay, this is where we expect to be at the end of a year or 3 years or 5 years. Now, how do we get there? How do we fill in that gap? And if filling in that gap means, well, we need to hire more folks in the accessibility area, maybe sight impaired, maybe hearing impaired. We need to hire more veterans because we don't have many. Maybe we need to stand up another ERG or employee resources group for veterans because there isn't one today that focuses on veterans issues. Sometimes we have our blind spots, even in leading this work. As someone who identifies as neurodiverse with ADHD and PTSD and a bunch of other letters, since we're talking about those today, so it wasn't apparent to me that we needed an ND employee resources group, a neurodiverse employee resources group. But after talking with some of our Mounties here, again, what we call our employees at a Mount, it was clear this is something that we can provide immediate lift for folks who are here today, as well as setting a consistent standard for those coming on board tomorrow.
I think too, what that boils down to is the person who is like the responsible party here is one who should be continuously committed to being curious and open-minded about the future of this space, right? The meaning of these initiatives. And so somebody who's willing to say, gosh, we've been doing this wrong, or wow, I didn't know this. I've been further educated. And so somebody who has that type of willingness to learn is really critical.
Also a willingness to know what you don't know as well and have an active role in listening. And I think it comes down to being strategic, and to make any type of systemic change, there needs to be buy-in from senior leadership, especially at an executive level too. And Antonio, to your point as well, just setting up an employee resource group is so important, and understanding where you are, wherever folks are at their organization. If you don't have any folks who have shared that they are veterans, if you don't have folks who feel like they are psychologically safe to share that as well, why is that? And really doing the internal work and looking to see if, we need to work with a third party, we need to hire someone to do this full time, we need to change our goals and objectives and be really specific. If we can't identify as a diverse organization, can we include inclusion in there? Can we include equity? Probably not. One of the kind of words that you used, Lauren, as well, was in that alignment. We're seeing more kind of questions and commitment coming from board levels, executives, leadership, hiring managers, and we also have talent leaders and recruiters. What does that alignment really look like in practice there?
You can go ahead, Antonio.
So when I think about the alignment, I think top down. Unfortunately, that's the way I think it needs to occur. And this is from the mind of a project manager. Until and unless there's an executive sponsor that you can carry their voice with you leading these DEI efforts, you're going to have some struggles. You're going to have some roadblocks. But if there's an executive sponsor, executive level, someone on your executive leadership team that says, all right, team, this is what we're doing, and this person or this group of folks are leading this effort, and what they put out as commitments or requests, consider those coming from me.
Mm-hmm. And taking that a step further from the board level, is the board supportive of this being a priority? If you don't have the board support, the executive team's already going to be challenged or, kind of torn between, what their own initiatives are, or what they've agreed upon as a company and an executive team versus where they have the board support. So you can see sometimes a conflict with that misalignment.
For sure. But I think also in addition to that, in practice, the alignment looks like pairing the right people again to the right outcomes. So identifying what our goals are, and then having the right folks working on those or towards those efforts. This includes the responsibility of goal setting, as I mentioned, and activities and accountability, monitoring, reporting against those goals to and through the executive leadership team, to the board if needed, but also reporting out to the rest of the organization. The rest of the organization needs to have an idea of what's happening when and who's doing what. That transparency not to be confused with visibility, is key. I see visibility as everyone in the organization sees what you're doing. Transparency is everyone in the organization sees how you're doing what you're doing. So providing a pull sort of format, maybe it's on your internet where folks can go to it and say, okay, these were our goals. Here are results from last quarter. This is how we're trending towards next quarter.
Something that came to my mind when hearing you talk, Antonio, is I've seen a trend of executive compensation being tied to diversity goals. And it's been, I feel like those situations have become very clear examples of where misalignment might happen and how that trickle down effect, that's so important is, the initiative, the support and desire of the executive team, but what is the execution? And when you have people who are tied, their compensation who are tied to these outcomes, they certainly become urgent, but how is the delivery happening? And there tends to not be a lot of consideration on how the delivery is going to happen before the goals are made or the commitments are made, which can create a lot of friction and a lot of, kind of a lot of mayhem in those types of situations.
Sure. And it may be counterintuitive to say, well, maybe the executive compensation should be detached from the DEIB efforts, because we don't want our executives to become commission-seeking used car sales folks. What do I have to do to get you into this diversity position today? What do I have to do to get you into this inclusion area today? While it's smart to say, yes, your compensation is going to be tied to the overall performance of the organization and the overall health of the employees, and employee health does include the work that we're talking about here today. Absolutely smart. I know from the research, I know from my experience and background that a better way might be to say, here's a baseline and here's a range that you might be able to accomplish based on how we measure against certain goals. Maybe the goal is 50% diverse hiring slate, which was one of the areas that I inherited when I moved into this role. Well, maybe 50% is right. Maybe it isn't. If we look at a 50% diverse hiring slate, we know that by default, 50% are not. They'll be middle-aged, white, cis men, and then that's 5. The remaining 5 will be 2 white women, 2 Black or brown men or women, and then 1 other person of color or other disenfranchised, marginalized person. So maybe 50% isn't right. So we need to say, not just are these the goals, but are they the right goals? And then how are we reporting against them?
Absolutely. You have to look at those goals and really come in with a curiosity-based mindset as well. I think if these past few years have taught us anything too, it's that business as usual cannot stay the same as well. You have to ask yourselves these questions. I want to talk kind of the equitability in the hiring process, and this relates to one of the questions that we have from the audience in terms of structure, right? And what we were talking about in terms of executives and leadership. It's not possible to interview with everybody at the company, but one of the questions was, I'm curious how you structure an interview from an internal hiring panel's perspective, specifically for a DEI role. How do you set these candidates up for success, and who are the right people to get in front of them so they can vet you as well? So who should be part of that process? And anyone can.
That's a great question for Antonio. Yeah.
I'll take it. First, let me qualify that the hiring process should be consistent for all potential employees. So that's internal as well as external. This means attracting, recruiting, hiring, onboarding, training, retaining, and eventually retiring all of those employees. And that needs to be considered as an essential function within the organization. So where organizations are paring back their HR department or people or talent or whatever they're calling it, they're paring that back, providing fewer resources, but expecting a greater output. It's increasingly difficult to provide a consistent experience for everyone that you are interviewing or expect to interview without the right level of resourcing there. In addition to that, I would say the right folks to answer the question, who should be interviewing them? Well, it needs to be a diverse interview panel. The diverse interview panel should be across the organization. It should not just be folks from your talent department. It should be folks from the functional leaders within the organization. If you have a development or engineering department, these are folks that you'll be working with every day in your DEIB efforts. They should be part of the panel, at least someone there. There should be not all men. There should be women or folks who identify as female on the panel. It shouldn't be all white. There should be people of color on the panel. If you have other folks who are in leadership roles at your organization who are within the Pride camp, they should be part of the interview panel. We want to make this as wide open as possible, because unless we're able to get the opinions and views and critiques from these specific groups of folks, their concerns aren't going to be addressed in the hiring of that DEI practitioner. So that's internal and external. Let's look at the, I know. Let's look at internal hires. So with internal hires, generally for a DEI or DEIB role, many times it's a one-for-one. It's a lateral from whatever role you're in into this new role. You're changing responsibilities, not necessarily an increase in your band or rate or anything like that. So the questions that we want to ask, same questions that we're asking for folks coming into the organization from outside, with a little bit of a difference in performance. How has this person or these folks performed over the past year, the last reporting period? What are we measuring them against? Are we measuring them fair and consistently? That means having set interview questions, so each applicant receives the same questions. This means providing accessibility where needed for accommodations. If the person is hearing impaired or speech impaired, how do we accommodate for these things? If we're not answering those questions before the interview, we're bound to miss.
I echo all of that. I think just in addition, a path of least resistance in terms of making really, really solid changes in the right direction is, of course, standardization, but also even something as simple as unconscious bias training for the people who are involved, really helping them understand what's the goal here? How do I participate? So it's definitely the structure of the interview, but it's also educating those people who are participating and how in which their participation matters. So that education can be really important and kind of an easy win for the team. I think also too, we've started to move away from this, but I still see a lot of conversations around culture fit. Culture fit should be a thing of the past. So really, how are you defining in your interview process? Is this interviewer a culture addition to the team? How are they adding to the culture? How are they adding to the diversity? How are their skills, their backgrounds, their life experiences adding to the team? And so finding ways to incorporate that into your interview process, rather than saying, is this a person I want to get a beer with? That should be a thing of the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to mention also, you talked a little bit about unconscious bias training, and I love it. One of the things that we're doing at Amount is building out specific training for all of our people leaders. And I know it sounds like I'm saying people eaters. I promise I'm not. So for all of our people leaders, these are folks who are leading other Amountees. They'll go through training on unconscious bias, hidden bias, implicit bias. They'll take trainings on conflict management, because we know not all conflicts can be resolved. They'll go through these trainings and then they'll get the functional training as well. How do we write an evaluation? How do we write that annual review? What things are being added to that? So once they're hired or move into that people leader role, they're not just ready, they're prepared to do the work.
I think a lot of things you're mentioning are resources too, like that do cost money, so I think it kind of goes back to my original point of like, you have to be willing to spend to make improvements. It doesn't have to be a large budget, but to impact change and have change, there has to be, modifications that are made from your existing, your existing status quo. So whether that, I think a good one is like the performance review, that Antonio was mentioning. These are the small additions or changes in resources that can really impact the team. One of the things that keep coming to mind when we're talking about these things is retention. We're talking a lot about hiring, but the goal through this entire hiring process and conversation is hiring people you can retain, creating a culture in which you can retain them.
For sure. I want to talk also about I know there are other questions that we have to get to, but the financial implications of doing the DEI work versus not doing it.
Mhm.
What I've seen is so many folks in leadership roles will happily spend the money on balloons and sandwiches for an event in the office. But when it comes to other DEI resources, we DEI practitioners have to explain the financial implications of that every single time we want to spend some money on something. So how do we do that? Well, I think it's important to say, okay, well, let's look at what the DEI resource is that we're looking to bring on board or what we're looking to use. And then we'll talk about what some of those impacts are. We know that highly inclusive companies are more likely to hit their financial target by up to 120%. We know that ethically diverse companies are 35% more likely to have financial returns above their respective national industry medians. We know that companies in which women held 20% or more of management roles, they generated about 2% more higher cash flows and returns on investment than companies with 15%. I'm sorry, that's for companies with 15% or fewer women in management roles. So these are some of the numbers that we need to make sure that we're sticking a pin in and bringing back to our leadership or our executive sponsors and saying, hey, this is what we'd like to do. This is where we are right now. This is how this effort will impact the entire organization. And these are the financial implications of not doing it.
I think like an example of that would be, having a conversation with revenue leaders. If we're not hitting, account executive headcount goals for this quarter as we ramp into some of these new best practices, what does that mean for team quotas? What does that mean for the sales org? And really having a really honest conversation about what those short-term repercussions might be.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing the kind of research and data around how this is critical to the business. It's not just a nice to have and the right thing to do, but it's a need to have in order to stay competitive as a business, as a talent leader. I want to dig into that retention piece as well. We've been talking about recruitment and hiring, which is really important. But once you do find someone who's going to be a culture addition to your organization, someone who's ready to take on the responsibility of guidance. Also, it's never one person's responsibility to ensure that a company is equitable and folks feel like they belong. But what does effective resourcing look like? How do you know when you and your team are really set up for success? Antonio, I know on our pre-call you shared with us an incredible spreadsheet. It looks like you have really built out incredible resources and have had the support of Amount leadership to do so as well. Can you talk a little bit about that effective resourcing and how you're set up for success?
Sure. So I came into this role earlier this year, and the first 30 or 45 days, I was head down in the gap analysis. It's impossible to do this sort of work adequately without knowing where you are today. So figuring out where we are today through platform data and reports through our ATS system, our applicant tracking system, our human resources information system, our project management information systems, pulling those reports, analyzing them, comparing them against market data. What are our peers doing today? What are our competitors doing in the marketplace today? And then expanding that out beyond the marketplace. We're in fintech, but let's look at investment banking. Let's look at retail. Let's look at all these other organizations, insurance and consulting companies. What are they doing and how are they measuring these things? So where we are and where we hope to be becomes our guideline, and how we fill in that gap from the gap analysis becomes our strategy. At Amount, we did build out a 5-year, 3-tier diversity strategy. Tier 1 are items that we can move quickly on. They're operational, they're transformative, they require no more than director level approval, they're low cost and low resource, so we should be able to move quickly on them. Level 2 items or tier 2 items will start next year, Q1, and go from Q1 of 2023 through Q1 of 2025. They are bigger, more robust, may require more resources and higher level of input from directors or higher than direct level approval. So that's our tier 2. And then tier 3 is how are we reporting on these things quarterly and then annually, starting with our inaugural DEI annual report, which will come out in December of this year. From that, we extrapolate all of our recommendations from our strategy. These recommendations are presented, and I'm kind of laying this out kind of as a roadmap for folks who are interested in doing the similar sort of work. Those recommendations can then be parsed out across the organization. These are things you can do in development. These are things you can do in talent. These are things you can do in resources. These are things you can do in rewards and benefits that will make an immediate impact, not just in bringing folks into the organization, but keeping them. How do we retain folks? And if we're unable to retire a Mounties eventually, how do we capture that tribal knowledge? How do we collect everything that they've learned, all the work that they've done without them leaving the organization and having a void there? Maybe they were a bottleneck, or maybe they were the only person on their team who knew how to do that sort of work. How are we accommodating them? How are we rewarding them for their performance while being able to share what they know with the rest of the team? So it's no longer just a one-person shop, one person knows everything here.
Yeah, I think that is really important. And also what I hear you say is it's very research insights based, understanding where you are. It does take time to do this gap analysis, and also 5-year plan. It's not a 6-month plan. It's not a 3-month plan to say, okay, we're checking this box so we don't have to work on it in 2023. It's really looking at it from a strategic lens, just like any area of the business, whether it's sales, product, and things like that as well. And there is accountability there too. I want to talk about also measuring kind of the goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion when we really kind of break it down there as well. Antonio, I know you kind of mentioned what not to do as well. And Lauren, I want to talk specifically around recruiting too, to think about how are you, what is the philosophy about measuring the impact of DEIB goals?
Are you talking about through the interview process?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you have to pick a North Star. What's the main way that we can measure what we're looking to determine as success? I think there's micro goals that can come from that, but it's really important if you're going from 0, you're not going to jump forward with a really sophisticated way of measuring your process conversions, what the measurements look like and what outcomes come from that. Take one measurement. An example of that is the Rooney Rule. A lot of people use that as their guiding light and move from there. Antonio used an example of a 50% diversity slate. Pick something simple, easy to measure, easy to capture, and really take that first step forward as something that's digestible to the team. You have to think to your talent team. People on your talent team might be working on diversity for the very first time in their career, and that should be really taken into consideration. And so what does the talent team's management look like? What is their experience with diversity? That should be taken into consideration. So again, that one step forward with a North Star is a really solid place to start. And then those backup micro goals as a support mechanism.
I love it. I love that you mentioned micro goals. When you think about selecting a simple goal and then measuring and reporting against that, saying something like, well, we want to hire 50% more women. Okay, that's great, but that's going to be tough to measure, especially if you don't know where you already are. If you pare that down to something like hiring more women, or explicitly hiring 2 more women per quarter for the rest of this year. Doesn't seem like a lot, but it's something that's easy to measure and will make an impact on the bottom line. Those goals, those larger goals that we're hoping to get to. Other smaller examples of things that we can measure is events, activities. We know events and activities are largely for our employees. But if we drop something in there that says, okay, is this a community event? Let's have 3 community events this year. That's relatively easy to measure. It impacts your DEIB efforts. It impacts your bottom line. It impacts the what we would call in the military, esprit de corps, or your spirit, or how you're working as a group there. It impacts all of these other things just by starting small, taking those simple steps from the beginning. So we know that we need an executive sponsor. We know that everyone in the organization should be running towards the same DEIB goals. We know that there should be visibility and transparency on what those goals are. And then we need to make them clear and plain. In this example, as Lauren was saying, something simpler. What's simple that we can do right now that we can measure against to say, yep, we're doing this thing. And you're not just a, hey, we're a checkmark DEI office. We did this, this, and this, we're done for the year. I'll tell you, your DEIB efforts are never done.
I think one thing that's, without a doubt obvious about what we're saying too, is you have to have the resources to track this. And so if you don't have, whatever you're using for recruiting, whatever you're using as your ATS, this can't live in a Google Sheet. A Google Sheet's a maybe a good place to start, but when we're talking about being, flexible and learning, your goals change. So the one way you're tracking it in a Google Sheet today is maybe not going to be the way that you track it in a Google Sheet next quarter. So that data becomes completely unusable and irrelevant to your team. You cannot build a historical trend when you're changing your benchmarks. And so really picking with, if diversity is top of mind, pick your tools accordingly. Choose recruiting tools that have diversity capabilities. Choose performance reviews, employee onboarding, ATS systems that can support this initiative. Otherwise, it's going to be such a heavy manual lift, and it's not going to be sustainable, especially if you're at a growing company.
Yay, sustainability.
Yeah.
Sustainability, consistency, what I'm hearing you saying as well is, defining that North Star, understanding that it can change, but also not remaining stagnant as well, because there is a lot that you can do, but start simple. There's something that you can start doing today, start doing tomorrow, and then effectively resource folks who are looking for talent, really hiring managers, and really understanding kind of that it's adaptable as well. And it's very versatile along those lines of really investing time, money, and resources. Lauren, do you have any technology or partnerships to identify folks who might be interested in these roles as well?
I mean, certainly biased here, but Findem is a great resource for that. I think Findem's really cutting edge in the sense of really creating an opportunity to do unbiased diversity recruiting. You can't run through a list of candidates and look at people's pictures to determine if you are recruiting the right folks into your company. That inherently is missing the mark. And that is typically a best practice with companies that don't have the proper tools. So using a platform like Findem, where you can have, blind recruiting, where you can target specific, candidate pools, or, really address specific issues or, demographics or types of people. Also attribute-based, sourcing is something that is really going to be important, especially as the market changes. If you have a really large candidate pool to choose from, it's not just about skills anymore. Of course, we're talking about diversity, but it's more than that. We're talking about life experiences. That's a part of diversity. So, who is this person? Where is this person from? What has this person experienced in their life? How do you source for that? Do you have a tool that can uncover those types of people? If not, then you need to reevaluate.
Those insights are so important. One of the things that we're doing at Amount is we're moving away from the full resume review in our interviews. We are moving towards a blind interview, and I think it needs to be. And I'll give you a quick example. We had someone say, oh, I'd like to recruit from this school because it's one of the top schools in this area. Okay, great. But what about all the other great schools? You are missing so much and so many of our potential candidates and the Mounties. In addition to that, I think that both executive leaders and the practitioners must become comfortable in being uncomfortable. There's going to be a time where you're not going to know everything. And they must understand that you're not expected to be an expert in all the areas of DEIB and know where to turn, where to lean when you need assistance in these efforts. And so you can step out of the way and let the experts step in. Specifically, while I mentioned my post-traumatic stress disorder and my ADHD and these things before, but I didn't know everything about these things. I still don't. I'm not the expert. So as the DEIB practitioner, it's my responsibility, it's my role to provide our employees, our Mounties, with an expert to speak to their causes. And that goes across the gamut, not just in one ERG or one group of folks, but across the organization. Setting up mentorship programs, for instance, one of our other recommendations for communities of color, a mentorship program for folks who identify as female, because we know, based on the research, communities of color do not always get the same level, the same consistency, the same sort of outcomes from their mentoring efforts. So it needs to be specifically catered to those communities. Same thing with women. Women have specific needs that are not being addressed by the traditional mentoring programs. So how do we address that? So the first part of addressing it is identifying it. Well, yep, we know that's a problem. What are we going to do about it, right? And I think that groupthink is a great way to figure out the what. What are we going to do about it? But if your groupthink is all folks who, in my opinion, if everyone at the table looks like me, it's not really a groupthink exercise. I'm not getting opinions from the Pacific Islanders in the organization. I'm not getting opinions from folks who identify as female or folks who are out of other communities of color, and their voices absolutely need to be heard.
I think something to note there too, when you're thinking about making this hire, think about your organization. The US based company versus a global organization has very different needs, and much more, global organization is going to need much more sophisticated and complex reporting and goals versus only a company that's based with, US employees. That is definitely something that should be an initial part of this sourcing or interview qualifications for this type of individual. Diversity in APAC looks a lot different than diversity in the US. How do you support that? How are you blending those metrics together? And what is your, talking about company averages and things of that nature gets a lot more complicated.
I absolutely agree.
Absolutely agree with that. The definitions, even when we're talking about kind of diversity in general at a US-based company, what does that actually mean? If we say we're celebrating joy, what does that mean? Defining the terms that we use and the language we use is so important. I know we have like 10 minutes left, so I want to get to some audience questions as well, and then end with our favorite call to action for folks outside of the hour that we have together, which is speeding by. One of the questions is, curious if there's a way to prime executive leaders who are interested in bringing on a diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging practitioner hire for being uncomfortable, especially when leadership has minimum diversity. What are your thoughts there?
I think one thing that comes to my mind is like radical candor. So you have to care personally and challenge directly. You have to be open-minded to that. So I think that's a great book to start with for a leader. They may have already read it. It's a good talking point to feel comfortable that this is a personal topic to a lot of people. It should feel personal, and that's okay. But to be able to have uncomfortable conversations is the way change happens.
Yes. Is anyone familiar with Emmanuel Acho, former NFL?
I don't think so.
So he has a podcast. Okay, so Randeep, I hear you. Nicole, I hear you. So he has his podcast and the book that spurred the podcast, which is Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man. This is not required reading, but it should be. It works as a great primer for folks, especially executives, because it talks about the experience of Black folk in America. It talks about the experience of Black folk in different areas of America, corporate America, friends, relationships. I think that anyone interested in really getting into this work, that's another great book to start with. That's Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man by Emmanuel Acho, ACHO.
That's a great recommendation.
Awesome. The next question we have is on the candidate side, and we've talked about this a little bit kind of indirectly with culture ad and really asking the right questions and things like that. But how do you kind of apply to, or what advice do you have to apply to a diversity, equity, and inclusion role with no direct experience, in quotes, with diversity, equity, and inclusion education or employee resource group experience? I know that for some folks, you might be seeing DEI program manager roles and other roles that require 10, 20, 30 years of experience doing this work, and it can be intimidating. What are your thoughts there?
Don't be intimidated. This is really like, let's say, new in the grand scheme of a timeline. Don't underestimate your ability to add value here. I think be really honest with yourself about where have you been proactive and aligned yourself to groups, organizations that speak to these initiatives. They don't have to be professional organizations. They can be personal organizations. I think you should be representative of the change that you want to see. So involving, like Antonio has listed many groups that he's a part of that have nothing to do with his employer. And those are still huge value adds when talking about what this person could bring as a practitioner to an organization in a professional setting. So start marketing yourself using those groups and organizations, whether it's on your LinkedIn and your resume, to really show that this is a value to you and that you have experience in this area.
Yes, absolutely. It's tough to follow you, Lauren, because you're hitting all the right points, and I love it. In addition to that, I would say, as a project manager by training, know where your work is. Know what your starting point is, know what your intended goal is, and then figuring out how to get there becomes that tricky part that makes folks a little bit nervous. Here's a tip for you. You don't have to do it alone. And you also don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are organizations out there that are doing this work every day at different levels. Some mature organizations that are willing to share their practices with you. There are some organizations that have stood up their own practice and they're still running with it, and they know the hurdles that you are going to run into. And then there are other organizations that may be like yours, just trying to figure out what to do and how to do. Lean on the resources that are available in the marketplace. Lean on your peers. And I can't put too fine a point on this. Lean on your sphere of influence. The folks that you can influence today in this area, in this type of work, are going to be your largest proponents, your biggest cheerleaders, and they can help carry that effort for you.
And I think, like, right now, call, Slack, email your current employer's practitioner, whoever that might be, whoever has that responsibility, even if there's not a full, DEI executive on board, and say just that, hey, I'm raising my hand. I wanna help. What can I be doing? What can I participate in? What can I sit in on? And it doesn't have to be so formal. It's really just about taking that first step of involvement.
Agreed.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we have 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we have time for the call to action, which is both for hiring and retaining. What is your CUTA for hiring and retaining your next diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner? For folks who are listening, both live into the recording, anyone can start.
I missed the first part of the question. I apologize.
Yeah, no worries. What is your call to action to hire and retain your next diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner?
Would you like to lead, Lauren?
Gosh, I would say, get honest. Get honest about what you're looking for. Get honest with the people who are involved in the process. It's one thing to think about the ideal state that everyone wants to get to, but let's talk about the good, bad, and the ugly about where we are today and who is the right fit for that. And then you can source and interview accordingly.
I think my call to action would be think about what you would expect as a new employee. And if you can answer that question as a new employee, I would expect some accountability. I would expect accessibility. I would expect accommodations when I need them. Being able to identify those things helps. And then take that list and hand it to someone who's not you. Let them vet it for you. And this could be inside the organization. It can be outside, because they're going to think of questions that you haven't thought of. They're going to think of a different perspective, and that's great. But you have to be okay with being uncomfortable. You're not the expert in everything. The first time you wore pants, they were uncomfortable, I'm sure, but we wear them. And what we continue to do becomes our culture. DEIB work, DEIB efforts, DEIB initiatives shouldn't be just work efforts and initiatives. It should be what we do as part of our culture.
Absolutely. It should be in the DNA of the organization. It should be really intentional. I think that you could have the best intentions ever and say you want to build a really diverse and equitable organization, but what are you doing to get there? What's the how, and how are you thinking about iterating your strategy again and again, and resourcing, supporting people, investing, again, time, money, and resources in those goals as well is really important. Lauren, Antonio, thank you so much for being on our webinar today. And thank you to our partners at Findem. And if you have questions about Findem or AllVoices, please let us know. The recording will be live on our site next week. And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you for having us.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks so much.
Goodbye.